Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm speaking from Barcelona. My name is Per Almeda. I'm the director of the Center for Contemporary Studies, the in-house think tank of the Catalan government devoted to global challenges. Our mission is to analyze the world's main political and social trends and how they affect our society. In this sense, we are glad to co-organize together with the delegation of the Catalan government in the United States and in Canada, and together with the Association of Political Scientists and Sociologists of Catalonia, today's debate to discuss the main issues involving the US election that will be held next week in the 3rd of November.
Thanks to the Ministry of Foreign Action of the Government of Catalonia for organizing this panel, in addition to the Institute for Public Diplomacy and Global Communication of George Washington University, the Wall Street Journal, and the Baker Institute for Public Policy of the Rice University. Why are the political scientists and sociologists of Catalonia interested into the presidential election? Among other reasons, I would highlight two. The first one, the United States election is pioneer in political marketing. From the Kennedy-Nixon debate in 1916 to the use of digital micro-targeting in 2016, political strategists look to the American election as reference. In the information society, these communication techniques are crucial in divisive and polarized societies. The second reason, the US election is crucial to global public policies. Since the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals needs a cooperative effort from all states around the world, the presidency of the United States is a critical actor who decides which kind of international politics will prevail between a realistic vision of the world and multilateralism, between a commonwealth and the national interest. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Pacheco and Mr. Almeda, for these opening remarks. I'd like to introduce myself now. Good afternoon to you all. I'm the moderator. My name is Raquel Sanz. I'm a journalist at the public Catalan television in Catalonia. I anchor the news right now, and I was the US correspondent from 2014 to 2017. So I covered the Trump victory in 2016, and I expect to be soon in the US. So I'm from here in Barcelona. So before I introduce our guests today, I'd like to remind you all, to all of our viewers, that at the end of the panelists' presentations, you can ask questions through the YouTube page chat, which is available at the right section of your screen. So with us today, Mr. Mark Jones from Rice University, Ms. Janet Steele from George Washington University, Ms. Sabrina Siddiqui from the Wall Street Journal, and David Smith, Mr. David Smith from The Guardian. We'll have some more opinions at the end of their presentation, so some more surprises. So let's start. Let's begin with Mr. Mark Jones. He's a fellow in political science at the Baker Institute and a professor at the Department of Political Science at Rice University. Professor Jones, the floor is yours.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here today, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak to y'all about the US elections, particularly focused on the presidential election. I'm going to try to go through relatively quickly some of the basic building blocks and then get into the Congress, and then we can leave time for other things during the question period. So one thing about the United States where we're different from, say, Spain, Catalonia, and most of Europe is that we really only have two political parties, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. Between them, Donald Trump and Joe Biden will win about 97 or 98% of the popular vote this election. We have other candidates, but they're completely irrelevant. They're mostly just testimonial candidates. What are the keys to this campaign? Well, in any campaign, the economy is pivotal. And the economy was purring along pretty well for President Trump up until COVID-19, at which time the economy went into a tailspin. It's recovered a little bit, but COVID-19 undercut President Trump's presidency and re-election bid in two ways. One, it really negatively impacted the overall economic growth, which the president was hoping to bank his re-election campaign on. And his handling of the pandemic has been viewed as substandard by the majority of the population. Another aspect of the campaign is just Trump's actions and behavior, his personality. All three of these things have tended to work against the president rather than in his favor, which is one of the reasons why he's trailing in his re-election bid by such a large margin. Now, one final thing that's sort of a caveat to everything I'm going to be talking about is much of this depends on survey evidence. And the polls, while nationally quite good in 2016, did have some errors at the state level, in part because of a lack of polling and a lack of polling in the final days. So, we always need to say, while Donald Trump is most likely going to lose, a lot of that essentially prediction is based on public opinion polls. And if the polls are very off, then the election night result could be off. I don't believe they're off that much. But that's always a possibility that we shouldn't discount out of hand. So in the United States, we still use this very archaic system called an electoral college. And in an electoral college, each state has its electors using a plurality vote, or mayoría relativa. So whoever gets the most votes in the state wins all of the electors. So if California, which has 55 electors, if you win by one vote in California, you get all 55 electors. And the person who loses by one vote gets 0. The two exceptions to that are Nebraska, where 2 are allocated at the state level, 3 in each of their congressional districts, and Maine, where the same thing occurs with the 2 congressional districts there. So this is the playing map. What this election isn't is a popular vote. So Hillary Clinton, for instance, won the popular vote in 2016. But ese es como ella ganó en tiros al arco y ganamos en un partido de fútbol con goles. Y Donald Trump metió más goles in que él ganó electores. So it's really, electoral college is what matters. Your popular vote, how well you do in the population, doesn't matter. There's nobody who thinks that Donald Trump has any hope of winning the popular vote this cycle. He still has a thin chance of winning the electoral college vote. The states here, the red ones are ones that he won, as well as what Mitt Romney won in 2012. The ones that have lines through them, Iowa, Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Florida, are states that Donald Trump won in 2016 that had been won by Barack Obama in 2012. Those are the states he flipped. And he flipped 3 of those states by very narrow margins. And this is, I think, always important to remember that were it not for about 11,000 votes in Michigan, and about 54,000 votes in Pennsylvania, or about 23,000 votes in Wisconsin, if Donald Trump hadn't won 2 of those 3, he would not be president of the United States. So where are we today? Today, we're in a situation where you see the colors here, the dark blue and the next shade of blue down. So dark blue like Washington, Oregon, California, New York, these are sure things for Joe Biden. The darker blues like Colorado and New Mexico, those are also pretty sure things for Biden. Likewise, the dark reds, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, Arkansas, those are locks for Donald Trump. The pinks, Kansas, Missouri, South Carolina, Indiana, are also pretty much in the Trump camp. So the overall election then moves around to a small subset of elections. Those are in states that are viewed as competitive. One of them, Texas, right now is leaning towards Donald Trump. A whole group of them, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, New Hampshire, Nevada, Arizona, are leaning to Joe Biden. And then there's a set, Iowa, Ohio, North Carolina, Georgia, and Florida, that are real toss-ups. Right now, neither candidate has an advantage. One way to conceptualize all of this is that right now, Joe Biden is in a pretty good situation. If he just wins the dark blue seats, which he has locks on, and the seats that are already leaning towards him, places like Arizona, Nevada, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, they already are leaning to Biden. He has 290 electors. You only need 270 to win. And so therefore he has 20 more than he needs. He could lose Wisconsin and Minnesota and still have enough. Donald Trump is the opposite case. He has to win the pink state. In addition to the red states, he has to win the pink state of Texas. Then he has to win all of the toss-ups, Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, Ohio, Iowa. After he's done that, he still only has 248 electors. He still needs to win 22 more in order to be president of the United States, which means he then has to go in and flip a few of these blue states. Realistically, he probably needs to win Pennsylvania and then one other state. That's a pretty tall order, which is why right now I think we'd say Biden has a 7 in 8 chance of victory, Trump only a 1 in 8 chance. And just to sort of put a little details, I know I'm running out of time. This is just the pink state. You can see Texas, he's just slightly ahead. If we go to the toss-up states, half of them are leaning slightly towards Trump, half of them are leaning toward Biden. But recall, Trump has to win every single one of these to have a chance in the election. And then Trump has to come into the light blue territory where you can see Biden has an advantage in all of the states by anywhere from 5 to 7 or 8 points. And therefore, Trump has to actually win 2 of these states or perhaps 3 of them, depending on the size, which is a pretty tall order. We also know that the US House, it's a fact, it's going to stay in Democratic hands. The only question is, does the Democratic Party win 235 seats, say increasing its number of seats by 2, or does it increase it by more around 25 or 30 seats up to around 260? But it's a certainty the House is going to remain in Democratic hands. That means on election night, probably the most interesting thing is going to be the US Senate. Because if the Democrats win the presidency and Joe Biden is president, and we know they're going to control the House, the only vehicle or veto player that Republicans would have is if they continue to control the Senate, which they now have a 53 to 47 advantage. The downside for Republicans, though, is in the Senate race, there are only 2 vulnerable Democrats, Doug Jones in Alabama, who's likely to lose, and Gary Peters in Michigan, who's likely to win. 2 Republicans are likely to lose, or at least leaning that way, Martha McSally in Arizona and Cory Gardner in Colorado. So therefore, on election night, we're going to be watching these 6 states primarily, because if Democrats can get to 50-50 with Kamala Harris as the vice president, then they'll control the entire US government, and they'll be able to implement their policy agenda in a much easier way than if Republicans retained a narrow majority in the Senate. So I'm going to stop there, and I would be happy later on to discuss any of these points in the question and answer period.
Thank you so much, Mr. Jones, for your insights. It's my pleasure now to introduce Ms. Janet Steele, Director of the Institute for Public Diplomacy and Global Communication, Professor of Media and Public Affairs and International Affairs at George Washington University. We are ready when you are, Ms. Steele.
Okay. Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be here. I am in Washington, D.C. now, but I actually vote in Florida. So as Professor Jones pointed out, my vote really matters because that's one of those key states. I teach about theory and practice of journalism, and today I'm going to just give a brief overview of 3 really important things that I believe are happening in the United States media right now, and then we have 2 outstanding national journalists who will be able to get more in the weeds with you. But I'd like to just leave you with 3 trends that I think that are happening that have had a big influence in coverage of this election. The first is, I think everyone in the world knows that American media is very polarized right now, whether it's on Facebook or whether you watch CNN or Fox, people are very polarized. Why is that? Well, one explanation has to do with the decline of the local newspaper, that within the last 15 years, more than 1 in 5 newspapers has gone out of business. And today there are half the number of journalists who were working 15 years ago. So there's been a big decline predominantly in local news. Why does this make a difference? Well, in my own hometown of St. Petersburg, Florida, there used to be two newspapers, the Tampa Tribune, which was slightly conservative, the St. Petersburg Times, which was slightly liberal, so people had a choice, but both were mainstream newspapers, and they would have reported very fairly on the election. When the St. Petersburg Times bought the Tampa Tribune and it went out of business, there was only one paper. So that meant that all of those Tampa Tribune readers who had been somewhat more politically conservative, they now watch Fox, which is very conservative. So there's been a real split, a real polarization, partly caused by the decline of these local newspapers, which were generally in the middle. The second thing that's happened has been the role of ratings. And as everybody in the world knows, Donald Trump has a way of completely dominating the airwaves and taking up all the air in the room. Now, in fact, he said at the end of his first year in office in 2017, he predicted to the New York Times that he would win re-election because newspapers, television, all form of media will tank if I'm not there, because without me, their ratings are going down the tubes. So there is some truth to this, that back in the 2016 election, some people felt, well, it's good for the electorate just to see Donald Trump unfiltered. But unfortunately, that didn't work. He just managed to dominate everything. So in this election, a lot of media critics have said, stop giving him so much airtime. Don't report on every single tweet that he releases, because it just gives him way too much coverage. Let me give you one example. Back in July, Trump tweeted that we should delay the election. It was one tweet. After that, this dominated the American media agenda for at least a week. All sorts of discussion. Could he? Would he? Was he even legal to delay the election? And just to give you a quick statistic, according to the Stanford News Analyzer, in October, Trump was on CNN 1,300 times, Biden 800 times. In October, up to the middle of the month, Trump was on almost 600 times and Biden was on 179 times. So he's still managing to dominate completely the airwaves. The third thing, and I teach about news conventions, newsroom conventions, the things that journalists always do. Well, Trump has managed to violate almost all of those rules. And journalists have had a lot of trouble knowing how to respond to this. One of the biggest problems has just been his lies. The Washington Post, my hometown newspaper here in Washington, has doggedly been reporting every time he lies. Well, at the end of August, he had made 22,247 claims that were not true or that were lies. 22,000 lies. They also estimate that he makes 50 false or misleading claims a day. So how do you report on this? Because as you know, what the president says is news. So there's been something very interesting that you might want to pay attention to. Journalists call it the truth sandwich, which is where you start with the truth because it's the first statement that people pay attention to. So you start with the truth, then you indicate the lie, and then you return to the truth. And this is a way of, yes, reporting on what the president says, but also putting it in context. And I'll give you an example of a truth sandwich. This would be, you could say, it's been a few days since vice presidential nominee Kamala Harris joined Joe Biden's ticket, and birtherism attacks have begun. A Trump campaign advisor is openly questioning whether Harris is eligible to be on the ticket. Harris was born in the US and is clearly eligible. So that's a truth sandwich where you start with the truth, you then state the false claim, and then you come back to the truth. The one other thing that's really interesting that I think all of us are going to be following is how American journalists cover the election night. Because it is pretty clear that on election night, there will not be a clear winner. Well, that does not mean that the United States has gone to hell in a handbasket. It just means all the votes have not yet been honestly counted. So it's really important that American news organizations acknowledge that what they know and what they don't know, and also prepare Americans, and I guess the rest of the world, for the idea that it may take some time before we have a definitive answer as to who actually won, and also to remind the public, international public and American public, that it's In most states, it's the Secretary of State who certifies the vote count, and that never takes place until a couple of weeks after the election. So yes, this is normal. This does not mean that the election was fraudulent, and it is really, really important to keep emphasizing that. So those are my 3 points and my final thing to look at, and I am eager to hear what all of my colleagues have to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Steele. So many interesting topics. As a journalist too, I totally understand and share what you say. I lived those elections in 2016 and I have, well, I guess there'll be plenty of questions for all of you. Let me remind again, just this, that you can use the YouTube page chat to send us any questions to our panelists regarding the 2020 election and their presentation. So now, I'd like to introduce Ms. Sabrina Siddiqui. She's a national politics reporter at the Wall Street Journal based in Washington, D.C., and now she's currently covering the Biden campaign. Ms. Siddiqui, you can take it over.
Thank you. My name is Sabrina Siddiqui. I appreciate being able to participate in this insightful discussion with some other great people and experts in the field. This has obviously been a remarkable election and unlike anything that any of us have covered before. And that sounds familiar because that's what we said in 2016 with the rise of an insurgent candidate named Donald Trump, who went on to shock the nation and the world with his victory, despite all of the disadvantages he had in polling and fundraising and criticism across the spectrum, including from members of his own party. This time, of course, the stakes are very different, and that's because he is an incumbent president. And again, he faces an uphill climb with respect to victory. He's been lagging in both national and battleground polls, and that is drawing a lot of comparisons to 2016. But of course, with 2 major exceptions, one of which is that he has been president for 4 years. And so opinions of President Trump, we've seen in our polling at the Wall Street Journal, as well as across the board, that people's minds are largely already made up about President Trump. There is a much smaller percentage of undecided voters compared with those numbers in 2016. And actually in our latest Wall Street Journal poll that we just put out in the last 2 days, we are not actually seeing evidence of the kind of late surge in President Trump's favor that 4 years ago at this same stage in the race helped propel him to the White House. The other, of course, factor that is impossible to ignore is the coronavirus pandemic and the way that it has upended the entire campaign, as well as the nation, with nearly 8 million cases across the United States and a death toll that is now reaching 227,000. And, as someone who covers Joe Biden's campaign, the Democratic presidential nominee, former 2-term vice president, I've seen that the Biden campaign has placed the president's handling of the coronavirus pandemic at the center of its campaign, of its strategy since March, when the pandemic first hit. Biden's message has been virtually unchanged, and it has remained almost entirely focused on what Joe Biden says is the president's inability to curb the spread of the virus, and what Biden has said is just a complete mismanagement of the virus by the Trump administration. So, obviously that has also meant that you haven't seen the conventional style of campaigning. And there's been a clear contrast too in how the 2 candidates have approached this election, with President Trump, despite his own diagnosis with coronavirus and an outbreak at the White House earlier this month, still holding these large-scale rallies where there hasn't been social distancing in place and people haven't really been wearing masks. His decision as president to politicize the public health guidelines that have been set by his own administration. And then, of course, Joe Biden, by contrast, not actually holding big campaign events and keeping a much lighter campaign travel, a much lighter campaign schedule, as he effectively just continues day by day to hit the president's response and actually saying fairly unequivocally, which is rare for even the nature of politics that we've seen over the last few months, Biden saying unequivocally that the president is actually responsible in many ways for the death toll here in the United States and for the way in which the virus has spiraled out of control. Now, if you kind of take all of that as the backdrop, what I will say And again, as we kind of will get more into this conversation about, so what is different compared to 2016? Well, that is what is different. Americans across the country have seen their lives paralyzed by this pandemic. We often talk about, what really drives voters at the polls. Conventional wisdom says it's the economy. 4 years ago, it was something a little bit different than that because the economy was very strong. It was clearly a change election. Immigration was obviously a big factor, as well as this complete frustration with Washington and the establishment. This time around, it's undoubtedly the pandemic election, with the American electorate facing 6-7 months in now, a reality where they're still at home. Their children are not back in school in most cases across the country. Millions of people have filed for unemployment, and life simply doesn't look like it used to. And so I think a big question will be, we've seen in polling that most Americans disapprove of the president's handling of the pandemic, and that's what has directly contributed to the drop in his approval ratings going into this campaign or this election. How much does that reflect at the ballot box? And is that really perhaps why President Trump, after all the noise of the last 4 years, might see his tenure limited to 1 term? A lot can change still. And, we saw last cycle that this election was decided effectively by roughly 77,000 votes across 3 states, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. Those states which had voted for President Obama twice, but then swung in then candidate Trump's favor, have been a key target of the Biden campaign. And now, of course, Biden is looking also to try and expand the electoral map, win in traditionally red places like Texas, Arizona, and Georgia, where Democrats have slowly gained ground. So I think a lot of it really now just comes down to turnout. We're seeing record numbers of early voting. But again, that's one of the big unanswered questions is, are those just voters who are voting early because of the pandemic? Or is this because there is actually some huge wave in enthusiasm? And is that enthusiasm, in fact, on the side of Democrats? Or is it offset by perhaps a lot more Republicans who will show up to the polls on election day and cast their ballots for President Trump? So that's sort of my lay of the land. I'm looking forward to, of course, getting into more of a discussion about what to expect and what we've seen with the rest of the esteemed panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Siddiqui. We'll go with Mr. David Smith right away. But before, we've also collected 4 brief opinions on the 2020 election from Republicans and Democrats abroad, from the current US correspondent for the Catalan television, and from the American Society of Barcelona president. We are ready to share them with you.
Hi, my name is Randy Allos, and I'm president of Republicans Overseas France. We're going into the last week of campaigning, and Trump is out there rallying with all the Americans across the country, and they're all behind him, standing and saying that they want law and order. They want a strong economy. They want the integrity of a man who stands by his words. For 47 years, Mr. Biden has been in politics and hasn't given a clear answer to many, many issues, as he's done during those last debates. And as we know, I am confident that America will choose the next president, Mr. Trump, with a great landslide victory. Thank you very much.
Hi everyone, bon dia. I'm Liv Rowley and I'm a member of Democrats Abroad in Barcelona. This election is something that I've been waiting 4 years for, and now that it's literally days away, it's both very exciting and very nerve-wracking. There's a lot at stake here in this election, as I'm sure you can imagine, from climate change to racial justice to access to healthcare and many more topics. As a woman, the Trump administration has been troubling. From a policy perspective, it's been discouraging to see policies restricting abortion access or rolling back Title IX protections. It's also been upsetting just to see the general behavior and attitude towards women of this president and the people he's surrounded by. Also, coming from a community impacted by gun violence, it's been very difficult to watch efforts to have more sensible gun control policies failed to move forward in Republican-controlled parts of Congress. So I am very excited for the prospect of a Biden administration. I believe that Biden and Harris are much more capable of understanding the needs of various parts of the American population and are much more willing to listen and to learn. And of course, a Democrat-controlled Congress would be a real cherry on top.
Hello, my name is Cesco Reverter and I am the TV3 correspondent here in Washington. TV3, as you know probably, is the Catalan Broadcasting Corporation. To me, one of the main topics in this election cycle is the extreme polarization of the American society. Each side looking at each other as an existential threat to themselves and to the democracy. I wonder how much this will change after the election, either with Trump at the White House or Biden at the White House.
Hello, I'm Victor with the American Society of Barcelona. I'm honored that Generalitat has sought my opinion on the U.S. elections, and so what is it about? ¿De qué se trata realmente? The 2020 election is a referendum on whether or not the American people have had enough of a president who has dishonored constituents with constant and demonstrable lies, shamed the United States by abandoning her allies and placating despots and dictators, normalized vulgarity and overt racism, destroyed a vibrant economy, as well as prostituting the White House for personal gain, and, of course, criminal, negligent mismanagement of the COVID pandemic. Now, while I may not agree with everything of the Biden-Harris platform, they're good, decent American patriots. It's time to get our country back. Refem la República Americana.
So, well, these are some of the opinions that we have listened to. Well, we've heard several key issues that have arisen already. Polarization, the economy, the strong economy that happened under the Trump administration before the pandemic hit. We'll go straight to these issues, including the questions that we're receiving from our viewers. We have several already, so we really appreciate that, and we thank you for that. But before that, let's hear one final opinion coming from David Smith. As I told you previously, he's the bureau chief of The Guardian in Washington, D.C., and he often works in the White House, so he can maybe provide us with some insights of the Trump administration. Mr. Smith, good afternoon. Every American is followed, every election in the United States is followed around the world due to the enormous influence that the US plays worldwide. What can be the impact in Europe of a Trump or a Biden presidency?
Hi, thanks for having me. David Smith of The Guardian. I've been here 5 years. Yeah, I think Europe, like the rest of the world, always watches American elections with intense interest, perhaps this time more than ever, just because of the disruptive nature of Donald Trump. One of his foreign policy legacies will be the way he's shaken up, rattled many of those historic alliances that have been in place since the end of the Second World War. And his critics would say, conversely, he has really cozied up to authoritarian figures in North Korea, Turkey, and most notably Russia, of course, and that ongoing mystery of his relationship with Vladimir Putin. I think it's important to say right now, a lot of the political debate in the US is probably more focused on Asia than Europe. China has been arguably the biggest foreign policy issue in this election. And a lot of commentators would say, rightly, China is the rising superpower, potentially the biggest threat to the US. So Europe has taken slightly more of a backseat. I think, sadly, perhaps sometimes it's taken for granted. I think Joe Biden would work hard to mend relations. Just to take one example, a country such as Germany, where, of course, Angela Merkel was pretty close to Barack Obama, and certainly not to Donald Trump. In fact, quite the opposite. It's pretty frosty. For the UK, of course, exiting the European Union through Brexit is going to be a real struggle for relevance. Reporting we done at The Guardian talked about how not so long ago, just a few years ago, the US would really value the UK as almost a gateway to Europe, as an interpreter of what was going on in Brussels. There'd be a lot of contact between the State Department and the UK, a very close relationship. That is now in serious jeopardy with Brexit. So the UK can't really offer that anymore. And so already the suggestions that a Biden administration would probably speak more directly to Germany or Ireland or other interlocutors, and Britain would be frozen out. In the two presidential debates that we've seen between Biden and Trump, there was not a single mention of either Britain or Brexit. So we're some way down the agenda here. The UK, of course, coming out of the European Union, desperate to secure new bilateral trade deals, perhaps with America above all, but that doesn't really seem to be a priority urgently for Biden, at least. And indeed, he's a Catholic, he's of Irish ancestry, he's very concerned about the potential impact of Brexit on the Good Friday Agreement, the threat of a return to a hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. Biden and other Democrats have said that's a line that must not be crossed, that Britain can forget about a trade deal if the Good Friday Agreement collapses. So that's a really tricky situation, and I think another indication that the so-called special relationship, the US-UK tie, is somewhat fading. It's something that Britain clings to affectionately, but a Biden administration is going to be more concerned with Europe holistically, and as I say, even that ultimately probably less important than Asia.
Thank you, David. Let's see what's their approach, because the truth is, as you said, that they didn't talk much about foreign policy in the last debate. How would you describe the Trump administration work routine inside the White House any given day?
It's been pretty wild. Tuesday will be my fifth anniversary of being in Washington. It happens to be an election day. I covered the Obama administration for a year or so, and that was sort of far more ordered and calm, and go along to your press briefing and be fairly structured. From day one, when Sean Spicer burst into the room, the White House, and said that Trump's inauguration crowd size was the biggest ever, it's been a roller coaster ride. And I turned to a colleague that day and said, I feel like I'm back in Zimbabwe, having previously been the Africa correspondent. And that, along with Kellyanne Conway's, quote, alternative facts, close quote, really set the tone for 4 years of, as one of the previous speakers mentioned, more than 20,000 false and misleading statements by the president. Press secretaries have come and gone. Trump has really thrived on chaos in that administration, hiring and firing staff at a record rate. And really, from what we understand, not reading his national security briefings, not heeding experts, and just winging it. And I think he rode his luck for 3 years. There was not a major crisis on his watch. And then, of course, coronavirus was precisely that. And his management style was found wanting now, with more than 225,000 deaths. I think at the start of the year, maybe he would have got away with it, and with an economy in decent shape would have quite possibly won re-election. The coronavirus has changed everything, and I suspect future historians will look back on that and say that, if he does lose, that was the defining factor. And just to give one example, I went to many of those White House coronavirus task force briefings. Of course, even the White House briefing room now, with far fewer journalists there, sitting 6 feet apart, many empty seats between us, which gives someone like me a more opportunity to ask questions of Trump. For example, where's Dr. Fauci today, and that kind of thing. And there was one where very early in the pandemic, Trump came in and confidently declared that the economy, or the shops, businesses would be back open by Easter. That even then he was downplaying the virus, saying it would be all over soon. and he just projected such confidence about that based on no science that sitting in that briefing room, I felt like an airline passenger who was strapped into their chair, who just heard the captain of the plane walk in and indicate he had no idea how to stop it crashing. He was the most powerful man in the world, making up it as he went along, not listening to the science. And really, for me, that's been a metaphor for much of the past 4 years.
Thank you so much for your insights, David. Just to remind the numbers, for example, we were all talking about the economy, but under his administration, the unemployment rate dropped to 3.5% in fall of 2019, which is the lowest in 50 years. As you said, he would have run on that, but then the pandemic hit and the numbers went bad. So let's start with the questions, because we're starting to have questions. So I'll start with you, Mark, because I have two for you. Let's see, Victor, he's asking for if you could address again the states with the most vulnerable Senate seats. And the second one, which says, that's from Guillem Puig. He says, is there any real chance of Texas turning blue? The Cook Political Report has moved Texas to toss up today.
Okay, yes, so I would say the Senate seats to probably watch are if we assume that Cory Gardner and Martha McSally, two Republican senators, are going to lose in Colorado and Arizona, respectively, and Democrat Doug Jones is going to lose in Alabama. That means we need to find 3 other seats for Democrats to get to their majority. The places that I would be watching would be Montana with Steve Daines, Iowa with Joni Ernst, Maine with Sue Collins, North Carolina with Tom Tillis, and Georgia with Sonny Perdue. Georgia has a second race that day as well, but it's under Georgia runoff rules, which means that no candidate will win on election day, and there will be a runoff featuring Kelly Loeffler and one Democrat in December. So on election night, I'd really focus in on Maine, North Carolina, Iowa, Montana. Those are sort of the places to watch. I think it's increasingly likely that Democrats are going to take control of the Senate, but if you're a Republican looking for something to hold on to, that might be the one last sort of firewall against Democrats having complete control of the government come 2021. In regard to Texas, Donald Trump's been the worst thing that's ever happened to the Texas Republican Party in the modern era. He's taken a party where Mitt Romney won by 13% back in 2012 over a popular Barack Obama, to a case where we are right now, where Donald Trump is slightly in the lead in the polls. We just had a poll that we released on Monday where he was up 5 points. Other polls have him down at 4, 3, and 2. It's going to be a narrow victory, and it's primarily going to depend on Republican turnout between now and Election Day. In Texas, we have early voting, and probably 80 to 85% of Texans will have cast their ballot before Election Day on November 3rd. But if Republicans don't maximize their turnout, get their voters to turn out in spite of being somewhat less enthused, then Biden could win Texas. If I had to do an even money bet today, though, I'd say Trump will still pull it out, but only by a few points.
Thank you, Mark. There's one I would say for you, Janet, because you were talking about the truth sandwich. And Lala Majabai asks, doesn't the constant verification of Trump's statements contribute to the increase on his media coverage? How much do voters care about his honesty? Well, all of you, sorry, I mean, I'm addressing the questions, but of course, all of you, you can engage each other.
That's a really good question. One of the things that social scientists have learned is that the people who read fact-checking stories already question the reality of the fact. So a lot news organizations have traditionally done fact-checking, but it's kind of like preaching to the converted or preaching to the choir, that the people who are willing to look at fact-checking reports already doubt the truth of the statement. And that's actually not just true in the United States, that's true everywhere, that I think most countries have some kind of a stop hoax website or whatever. There are a lot of really good ones in the US, but people tend not to pay attention to them, and they believe what they want to believe. And this has also been a big problem for journalists, that, I think journalists are generally, people who believe in facts and believe in truth and think that everyone should be like that. But sadly, in the US right now, there are people who really don't seem to care what the facts are, or as David pointed out, they believe in what Kellyanne Conway notoriously called alternative facts.
Right.
I think it's been interesting in this election to see the media learning some lessons from the last campaign and from the Trump presidency. I think there is more fact checking. There is more diligence about whether just to show Trump giving a campaign rally unfettered and edited, and his rallies get far less coverage than they used to. And perhaps the best example is this time, the Trump campaign is cooking up conspiracy theories about Joe Biden's son, Hunter, which are getting big play on Fox News and other conservative media, but very little coverage elsewhere. There's not been the same rush to cover them in the way there was Hillary Clinton's scandals. Really, the 4 years has been a big journey, big educational event for the media, and just in terms of how to deal with Trump's false statements.
Let me ask you something, because you were talking about the ratings, Janet, and you put up the numbers about the coverage affecting Trump and Biden. And I still remember what Jeff Zucker, the head of the CNN, said in 2016. If I am not wrong, they were very happy during the campaign because their ratings were they skyrocketed. But then Zucker admitted that if we made a mistake, that was a month before the election. He said, if we made a mistake, it was that we shouldn't have put on as many Trump rallies as we did. Has anything changed during these 4 years?
There's a lot of talk about it. People talk about this all the time. David is absolutely right. The lessons we should have learned. Here, the Washington Post media critic Margaret Sullivan has flat out said, do not report on his tweets, because he can say the most outrageous things and then that dominates the news cycle. But the problem is it's so tempting. I mean, I myself, I open up the websites and the first thing I read are all the stories about Trump. So, and I know better. So he is extremely entertaining and he has improved. I mean, he's increased coverage, he's increased ratings. And so that is a problem, right. That we could read Biden's plan for his revisions to Obamacare, but people would rather see some outrageous tweet from Trump.
And I would say, because you mentioned the quote from Jeff Zucker in 2016, one of the quotes that really stood out at that time was from the head of CBS, who had said famously that Donald Trump is bad for America, but good for ratings. And so I think that there's been a lot more scrutiny stemming from 2016 with respect to how the media covers candidates and campaigns, and more introspection inside of newsrooms across the country on what the media collectively do better and what hand it may have played in contributing to Trump's rise, not just to the White House, but also the Republican nomination for president, because that element of carrying his rallies across the networks meant that he got, I think, at the point where they were still at the height of the Republican primary. So this was about March of 2016. He had received roughly $2 billion in earned media, which is basically what we refer to as the amount of free coverage, publicity stemming from TV coverage that a candidate receives. And that was all measuring, the amount of airtime he got across all of the major networks. And what that meant is other candidates couldn't break through. No other candidates' rallies were carried live. Even Hillary Clinton's rallies in the general election would sometimes be carried live, sometimes not. Now, what's been interesting is in this cycle, in the beginning, when Joe Biden was doing some events in the earlier stages of the pandemic, he was largely doing virtual events. And then when he started to travel again, and he would give these speeches from his hometown in Wilmington, Delaware, there was in the initial month or so, a lot of complaints from his campaign. And you would see on social media, not just his campaign, but from Democrats, as well as just progressives, liberals, that none of the networks were carrying Joe Biden's speeches. And then at the same time, the media was saying Joe Biden's nowhere to be seen. He's just, he's just hiding in his basement, which is a line the Trump campaign was putting out to the public. So that pressure campaign actually did work. And then you started to suddenly see every time Joe Biden went out to speak, then the networks would actually carry that speech. Certainly if he was making any news or giving remarks on the pandemic, laying out his plans on the economy. So there's been some element, and David also, I think, very rightly brought up the issue of Hunter Biden. And I don't want to get too much in the weeds on all this, but, knowing that, if there was some element of misinformation, and in 2016, we now know in retrospect that a lot of that misinformation was coming from the Russians. There needs to be a lot more caution around what the source of information is. Now, in this case, of course, there isn't actually evidence at the moment to suggest that, the stuff with respect to Joe Biden's son is directly coming from the Russians, but certainly a lot of pro-Russian propaganda outlets have been pushing it as well. So I think there's just a little bit more attention toward all of the ethics and standards that we should hold ourselves to. And the only other thing I'll say is on just the question of honesty, it is true that there's been a problem for the media with respect to, Americans, and this is reflected in polls, not trusting the media in the same numbers that they perhaps did. But the polls also consistently show that they trust President Trump even less. And so I think ultimately, he's got his faithful base of supporters, but there is almost never a poll where a majority of Americans trust President Trump on issue X. And I think that is because they have it's baked into who he is, that at any given day, what he's saying is either misleading or outright false. And so, that's why he's got his base, but he doesn't have a coalition, and he's going to need more than just his base to win less than a week from today.
Another question maybe for you, Sabrina, maybe for David too. Aleix Anselmos asks, an hypothetical Sanders campaign would have been more effective in the Rust Belt than Biden's?
Yeah, this is a loaded question because it comes up all the time. And I think it's interesting. I don't think anyone can definitively say this. This came up in 2016 too. Now, one thing about Bernie Sanders that is true is that he has been a much more inspirational candidate to people. If you look at the energy and enthusiasm at his rallies, the crowds that he draws, and sort of a real movement that he's created on the ground, then yes, I think you could say that, he has something that Joe Biden doesn't or that Hillary Clinton didn't. The problem is that those people have not actually turned up at the polls when Bernie Sanders has needed them. So I think in 2016, if you had some of these DNC rules around superdelegates or just like a procedural, a process that kind of helped Hillary Clinton to some degree, this time they didn't have that same process. It was just Bernie Sanders himself had a hand in writing the rules for how they picked the Democratic nominee. And it just came down to whoever gets the most votes wins the nomination. And he staked his campaign on young people, and he has record numbers of support with young people, which is where that idea that he's perhaps more likely to win because he inspires people, that's where that thinking comes from. But those people did not turn out in the primaries. And actually the same kind of Obama to Trump voters who the person who asked the question is asking about, those people actually swung more in Joe Biden's favor in the primaries in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. So actually, if there is any data to tell us who those Obama to Trump voters would be more likely to back, when they had the choice this cycle, they chose Joe Biden. And I think that, if you look at even just the general election narrative, Joe Biden is constantly on the defensive about this question on whether or not he's a socialist. Like a lot of the pushback that he and Harris are getting in media interviews, they're asked about it. Sometimes on the campaign, they're forced to defend themselves. Is really, are you a socialist or not? And so, I think that does show some limitations, at least right now, for what Bernie Sanders represents here in America, where I think the next generation of voters, if this election were 4 years from now, 8 years from now, then I would tell you, I think Bernie Sanders would have a very strong chance of winning the election. This country, based on all the data we have available, does not seem to be there yet. But look, I think one day we might see a President Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and the Sanders effect has been to usher in all these progressives into Congress and into national politics. And I think they will generationally, move the country in the kind of direction that Sanders has been pushing for decades now.
Yeah, I was just
go ahead,
quickly.
David, and then we'll go to Janet.
Okay. Oh, sorry. Yeah, I agree with all of that. I interviewed a long-time Democratic strategist recently who said, there's nothing that unites the people of Earth like a threat from Mars. And I think for Democrats, Donald Trump is an existential threat from Mars. He's been tremendously unifying. So in 2020, you just haven't seen those same bitter divisions between the center and the left, as you saw in 2016 between Clinton and Sanders. And I also think, I bow to the wisdom of Democratic primary voters in choosing Biden. He neutralized many of the attack lines. He obviously not subject to the misogyny and sexism that Clinton suffered in 2016. But I think a bit like Sanders, he's also not vulnerable to the charge of New York metropolitan coastal elitism. For some people, Hillary Clinton had that. She talked about the deplorables. She was seen as looking down on blue collar workers in the Midwest, whereas Joe Biden actually comes from Scranton, Pennsylvania. I think when he makes gaffes, it actually makes him seem authentic to a lot of people, that he's not a polished politician like the Clintons, but he's like you and me. He is a man of the workers. So I think in demeanor, if not in policy, he's actually got a lot of the same strengths that Bernie Sanders has, and that was borne out in the Democratic primary and appears to be borne out in the national polls right now.
Janet.
Just to follow up on that, I think David is absolutely right. In 2016, there were a lot of people who voted for Trump because they were Hillary haters. It's not that they liked Trump so much, they just couldn't stand Hillary Clinton. So those people, they may have declared themselves undecided 4 years ago. At that point, there were like 20% of Americans were supposedly undecided, which probably meant they were actually leaning Trump, but just didn't want to say it. Now the percentage of undecided is tiny. Perhaps you guys know better than I do. The last I heard it was 7, which you still wonder, that seems high. But the point, to speak to something that Sabrina said that I think is so true. My younger brother, the one who was the Tampa Tribune editor, he's a registered Republican, but from the very beginning, he said, it's got to be Biden. Biden is the only person who is not divisive, that he's going to unite people. He actually brings on board people like my brother. And I loved at the second debate, which was supposed to be the third debate, when Trump was going after Biden for being a socialist. And Biden said, look at me, I'm Joe Biden. I defeated all those guys. I'm Joe Biden, which is true, that he's not, to label him a socialist, it's just ridiculous if you're an American. I mean, it's just ridiculous. And certainly your listeners know what a socialist is, and it's not Joe Biden. And so, that really hasn't worked despite Trump's best efforts.
So let's go with the final question, which I think it's a very interesting and concerning one. Jaume Lozano, I think this is for all of you, and we'll end with this one. Jaume Lozano says Trump has said that if Biden wins the vote, is going to be rigged. Can Trump refuse to wait the mail-in ballot and proclaim victory?
I think a lot of that will depend on how close the election is. If we're in a situation like Florida back in 2000, where it's effectively a tie and whoever has the best legal team wins the election, we could be in for some real trouble in the United States, simply because I don't know if we were able to handle it in 2000. I don't know if we'd be able to handle it in 2020 with Donald Trump. On the other hand, if there's a relatively large margin of victory, which I think is increasingly looking likely, where Donald Trump isn't losing by 1 or 2 states, but there are 5 or 6 states, and then within those states, the election isn't closed, I don't think there's really any worry. The only worry would be if it's a very tight election in the Electoral College, where 1 or 2 states make the difference, and then within those 1 or 2 states, it's a narrow margin, 10,000 votes, 20 or 30,000. If we hit that scenario, yeah, we could. Then I would actually be quite concerned about potential conflict, at least for a period. But I think the more likely scenario is, Donald Trump by early on election night will have lost enough states on the Eastern time zone that it'll be pretty much fait accompli, and we won't have that trouble. But it is something to be concerned about, and I think it's why some people are, in some states and some cities are at least making behind-the-scenes preparations for the potential for protest and violence were something like that to occur.
What about the rest of you? Well, let me put it in other words. In American history, you've had always this peaceful transition, right? The peaceful transition of power. Do you foresee this possibility in this upcoming election?
Well, I think the difference, of course, here compared to previous cycles is you have a president who is not willing to commit to a peaceful transition of power, and that will be a major test for the institutions and Republicans in Congress, who for the most part have gone along with anything the president has asked of them. But we have to, Republican leaders in Congress, Mitch McConnell, the Senate Majority Leader, they've said that if Joe Biden wins, or no matter who wins, really, they expect a peaceful transition of power, which is their way of trying to dismiss Trump's threats. Now, Trump made these same threats in 2016, but this just didn't come to pass because he ended up winning. So we haven't actually seen this tested. But I fully concur with Mark that I think a lot of it depends on the margins in some ways. And I think it shouldn't be that way per se, because Donald Trump himself only very narrowly won in 2016. And so the idea that if Joe Biden only narrowly wins in 2020, that should lead to some kind of contested election, that obviously doesn't really make sense, especially when there's no reason to doubt the mail-in ballot process. But I mean, that's something that the president has openly said he is willing to do, and that he was willing to challenge us in the courts. Again, if it's a big margin of victory, then that becomes a lot more difficult for the president to do. But it wouldn't be the first time we don't have a winner on election night either. We have had previous elections where it has not been called, and also elections that have gone to the court. So, it's not completely uncharted territory. I think the bigger concern that America is grappling with is you have a president who is willing to fan the flames from the highest office in the land, and who is kind of goading his supporters into this idea that this election is illegitimate, telling them to show up at the polls. So I think that there's a lot, of concern about chaos that could emanate from the outcome, depending on what it is. And that will be a big test, again, for the country and for all the institutions that uphold this government.
If I could add something, I have colleagues who are on the Media for Democracy's Election Coverage and Democracy Network, and they have put out a set of guidelines for journalists, which I think are just so important. That, first of all, there's always, as my colleagues know, there's always a big rush to declare a winner, and and that's one way to get in trouble. But also, I think journalists have an obligation to help prepare their readers, their listeners, for the fact that there may not be a winner, a clear winner on election night, and that does not mean that there's something wrong with the election, that this is to be expected, this is normal, this is the way it should, this is a pandemic, there are a lot of write-in votes, we have to count those votes, not write-in, mail-in votes. And so I think that the news media have a very important task ahead of them in terms of just preparing the public for the fact that it does not mean the end of the world, the end of the democracy, if we do not have a clear-cut winner on election night. And in fact, we probably won't.
Right. And that, just along those lines, it's important for people outside of the United States to remember we have one of the most inefficient electoral processes in terms of administration in the world. The principal units that manage our elections are the local counties. In Texas, we have 254 of those, ranging from highly professional outfits to people where their only infrastructure is one 15-year-old computer. Because of that system, there's no national organization. Sometimes things just take longer simply because you don't have the streamlined centralization that you have in most countries of the world, where elections are managed professionally from the top down, not from the bottom up, like here in the US.
So we can't rule out the fact that we might not have the definitive results on election night. That's a possibility, open possibility. Okay, I don't know if you have any final thoughts. If not, we'll just close this panel. I really think that you run very interesting topics and issues and thoughts. So thank you so much, all of you. To close this event, final remarks from Mr. Isidre Sala. He's the head of the delegation of the government of Catalonia to the United States of America and Canada.
Thank you very much, Raquel, for your excellent job.
And of course, thank you very much to all the speakers today on behalf of the delegation of the Catalan government to the US, and of course our partners here today, the Center for Temporary Studies and the Association of Political Scientists in Catalonia. So we thank you very much because you have shared with us very interesting insights of this very decisive election. We already follow this campaign, but I think we can affirm that thanks to you today, thanks to your wonderful job, we have a now better, clear understanding. So we achieve our goal. This is a complex system when we look at it from Europe, and all what has been said in the debate today is definitely helpful. Thanks, Mark, for sharing with us the complex system of the Electoral College and updating us on what's going on in Texas. Thanks, Janet, for explaining us about the media polarization and its origins. And of course, about these new techniques that are being used nowadays to convince public opinion. Thanks, Sabrina, for explaining how different is this campaign from the previous ones and how important it is the early vote. And thanks, David, for explaining us the switch in the traditional role of the US, of the UK as US gateway in Europe, and also how much the dynamics at the White House press conference have changed. I think besides your presentation, we have a very, very vibrant debate. So I thank you very much, all the audience that make questions. I know that there are more questions, but unfortunately this time is always a limitation. So, only a few days to know the results of this decisive elections. But based on the last comments of our speakers here today, maybe it's not clear. Maybe we'll take more days and we expect to have the result of these elections. And who knows, maybe we will need to invite you again to have another debate to explain what has happened. So let's see. In any case, for today's, we did, I think, a great job, and we thank you very much to all of you. I thank very much again, Raquel, and I thank very much the audience. We do this event because of you. So thanks very much to everyone, and we stay tuned for coming events that the delegation is organizing with partners.